Imagine coming home after a long day, ready to unwind, only to find an unauthorized vehicle sitting inside your garage as if it belonged there, not in your driveway, not parked illegally in front of your house. No, actually inside your private garage. And the worst part? The culprit wasn't some random thief or an accidental mix-up. It was none other than the self-appointed, overbearing, ever-meddling HOA Karen, the one person in the neighborhood who had built her entire identity around controlling what everyone else did. This wasn't a one-time slip-up, a misunderstanding, or even a minor infraction. It was the peak of entitlement, a level of arrogance so staggering that it almost felt surreal. This wasn't the first time Karen had overstepped, not even close. In fact, she had a long and well-documented history of treating other people's property like an extension of her own. From barking out parking rules she didn't follow herself to letting herself onto private lawns to inspect violations, Karen had made it her personal mission to enforce her own version of the HOA's regulations, rules that conveniently never seemed to apply to her. The entire neighborhood was fed up. The complaints had stacked up over time, but Karen had a way of twisting every situation in her favor, using her connections within the HOA to evade consequences. But this time was different. Because when Karen decided to help herself to someone else's garage, without asking, without permission, and without even thinking she'd get in trouble, she unknowingly walked into a trap of her own making. She had no idea that her self-righteousness had finally crossed the wrong person, and now, for once, there was no HOA loophole, no underhanded complaint she could file, and no excuse that could get her out of this. She had been caught in the act, red-handed. And the homeowner? Oh, they weren't going to let this slide. Karen had spent years making herself the dominant force in the neighborhood. She wasn't the official HOA president, but she might as well have been, considering how aggressively she policed every aspect of community life. She had a clipboard, a smug expression, and a seemingly endless amount of free time, which she dedicated to making sure no one's grass was even an inch too high, no one's trash bins were out a second too early, and God forbid no one put up unapproved decorations. She was the type to leave passive-aggressive notes on windshields, send out mass emails warning about rule violations that only she seemed to care about, and march around the neighborhood like a self-appointed sheriff. She had even been known to stop delivery drivers in their tracks, demanding they explain why they were in the neighborhood. She acted like she was protecting the sanctity of the community, but everyone knew the truth. Karen just liked power. The problem was, Karen had a nasty habit of helping herself to things that weren't hers. It started small, stepping onto people's porches to check their holiday lights, rearranging garbage bins because they were unsightly, and occasionally moving someone's lawn ornaments because they clashed with the aesthetic. But over time, her behavior escalated. She was caught walking into a neighbor's backyard claiming she needed to inspect their patio furniture. Another time, she pulled into someone's driveway and refused to move, claiming she had an HOA matter to deal with. People complained, but nothing stuck. Karen always had an excuse. She was acting in the best interest of the community. She was just making sure everyone was following the rules. If someone pushed back, she played the victim, accusing them of being hostile toward her efforts to keep the neighborhood in order. But then came the final straw, the moment Karen stopped pretending and flat out acted like she owned other people's property. It started like any other day, except this time Karen outdid herself. She didn't just step onto someone's property. She didn't just park in their driveway. She went full-on, no-holds-barred entitled mode and actually parked her car inside someone else's garage. Why? Because she wanted to. That was the only explanation she ever gave. She saw an open garage, decided it was convenient for her, and pulled in like it was her personal parking space. The homeowner, let's call him Mark, had already had enough of Karen's nonsense. He had caught her snooping on his property before, taking pictures of his yard, and even making snide remarks about how he needed to tidy up his garage to meet HOA standards. But this was an entirely new level of invasion. Mark watched in disbelief from his home security cameras as Karen casually drove into his garage, put her car in park, and stepped out like she had every right to be there. She even had the audacity to glance around, seemingly checking for any violations she might want to report later. For a moment, Mark just stared at the footage, trying to process what he was seeing. Who does that? Who just parks inside someone else's garage without even asking? Then it hit him. If Karen had just walked into his garage, she would have left quickly, but she had parked her car inside. That meant she wasn't leaving anytime soon. She had given him the perfect opportunity. Without hesitation, Mark walked over to his garage door control, hit the button, and watched as the door slid shut, locking Karen's car inside. It took Karen a while to realize what had happened. She had walked off, probably to harass another neighbor, but when she returned, her car was gone, or rather, she couldn't see it anymore. Because Mark had made sure she was about to have one of the worst realizations of her life. She stormed up to his front door, banging on it like she owned the place. "Open the garage!" she demanded. Mark took his sweet time answering. When he finally did, he leaned against the doorframe with the kind of satisfied grin that only comes from watching karma unfold in real time. "Oh, you mean my garage," he said casually. Karen huffed. "You know what I mean. I need my car." Mark shrugged. "That's funny, because last time I checked, this was my property, and I don't remember renting out my garage as a parking lot." Karen's face turned red. "You can't do this. This is illegal." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Illegal? Like parking inside someone else's garage without permission?" Silence. Karen had no answer for that because she knew she had no excuse. And the best part? Mark wasn't in any rush to let her off the hook. He had all the time in the world. She had spent years making everyone else's life miserable, acting like the queen of the HOA. But now? Now she was just someone who had to explain to the whole neighborhood why her car was trapped inside another person's garage. And Mark? Oh, he was going to enjoy every second of it. Karen stood there, fists clenched, her face shifting between rage and disbelief. It was as if her brain couldn't fully process what was happening. She had spent years getting her way, twisting HOA rules to suit her whims, bulldozing over her neighbor's rights with a smug sense of self-importance. But now? Now she was standing outside of someone else's garage, completely powerless, her precious car trapped inside a space she had absolutely no right to enter in the first place. For the first time in her reign of terror, Karen wasn't in control, and she hated it. Mark, the homeowner whose garage Karen had so graciously helped herself to, leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with the patience of someone who knew they had already won. He didn't have to raise his voice or act aggressive. He just had to wait, letting the weight of Karen's own actions settle in. "You're gonna regret this," Karen hissed, her voice low, as if she was trying to reassert some sort of dominance. But the desperation in her eyes betrayed her. Mark simply raised an eyebrow. "Regret what exactly? Locking my own garage? Keeping unauthorized vehicles off my property? Following the HOA rules?" Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. She was caught, and she knew it. But if there was one thing Karen had perfected over the years, it was never admitting fault. Instead, she defaulted to tactic number one, anger. "You think this is funny?" she spat, taking a step closer to Mark's front porch. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Mark chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Karen. The whole neighborhood does." That hit a nerve. Karen's eye twitched, but she quickly masked it with an indignant scoff. "You're gonna open that garage right now," she demanded, pointing a manicured finger at him like she was speaking to a misbehaving child. Mark tilted his head. "Or what?" That made her pause, because for once she had no answer. The commotion had already started drawing attention. A few of the nearby neighbors who had spent years suffering under Karen's iron-fisted rule had begun to peek out of their windows, drawn by the sound of her voice getting increasingly shrill. Some had even stepped outside, pretending to check their mail or water their plants, but it was clear they were here for the show, and what a spectacle it was turning out to be. Karen, who had spent her entire existence dictating how other people should behave, was now the one causing a public scene. Mark saw his next opportunity and seized it. "Hey, Jim," he called out to his next-door neighbor, who had been standing on his lawn pretending to adjust his sprinklers. "Did the HOA ever say anything about random people being allowed to park in other people's garages?" Jim, suppressing a grin, shook his head. "Nope. Pretty sure that's called trespassing." Karen's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "This isn't trespassing," she shouted. "I was only going to be here for a minute. It's not a big deal." Mark smirked. "Huh. That's funny. Because last week you fined Betty for leaving her recycling bin out 10 minutes too long, and you called that a serious HOA violation." A few chuckles rippled through the small crowd forming. Karen's lips pressed together so tightly they turned white. This wasn't going how she expected. Usually, she was the one holding all the power, the one threatening fines, calling in violations, making people scramble to comply with her ridiculous self-imposed rules. But now, she was the one on the defensive, and the neighborhood was loving it. Karen huffed and pulled out her phone. If there was one thing she knew how to do, it was escalate a situation. "I'm calling the HOA board," she snapped, as if that was some kind of ultimate trump card. "You're going to be in serious trouble." Mark pretended to look concerned. "Oh no," he said deadpan. "Not the HOA." Karen narrowed her eyes and stormed a few steps away, phone to her ear. The neighbors watched in silence, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Then, after a few seconds, Karen's expression changed. Her eyebrows furrowed, her lips curled slightly downward. It was subtle, but Mark recognized that look. The call wasn't going the way she had hoped. She had expected immediate backup for someone on the HOA board to swoop in, take her side, and put Mark in his place. But judging by her posture, things weren't that simple. Mark couldn't hear what was being said on the other end of the line, but he could guess. Because here's the thing. While Karen had always acted like she was the ultimate HOA authority, she wasn't actually on the board. She was just a loud, obnoxious presence that had taken it upon herself to enforce rules no one had ever actually voted on. And now she was realizing that the very people she claimed to represent weren't coming to her rescue. After a few tense minutes, she lowered the phone, fists clenched at her sides. She turned back to Mark with murderous eyes. Karen was no fool. She knew when she was out of options. And as much as it killed her to do so, she realized that anger wasn't working. The HOA wasn't coming. The neighbors weren't on her side. And Mark? He was standing firm, completely unfazed. So with gritted teeth, she did what she never thought she'd have to do. She changed tactics. "Look," she said, forcing a smile that looked more painful than genuine. "I think we just got off on the wrong foot. I wasn't trying to cause trouble." Mark raised an eyebrow. "You parked in my garage." "I was only going to be a minute," she insisted, her voice taking on a fake, sweet tone. "I didn't think it would be a big deal. I was checking on something for the community, and I figured—" Mark held up a hand, cutting her off. "Karen, I'm going to stop you right there. You and I both know you're lying." Her mouth snapped shut. Mark took a step forward, his voice firm but even. "You've spent years making everyone else's life miserable. You fine people over nonsense. You lecture them about community standards. You pretend to have more authority than you actually do. And now you've been caught trespassing on private property. And you don't like how that feels, do you?" Karen said nothing. "You're not getting your car back until I decide you've learned your lesson," Mark continued. "And if you keep making a scene, I'll be calling the real authorities." That did it. Karen visibly paled. This wasn't just a petty neighborhood dispute anymore. If Mark followed through and called the police, this could turn into something much worse for her. Trespassing, unauthorized use of property, maybe even an attempted break-in, and worst of all, her reputation would be ruined, not just in the HOA, but throughout the entire community. She had spent years carefully crafting the illusion of control, but now that illusion was shattering, and she was helpless to stop it. Mark could see the panic settling in, the realization, the fear, and he enjoyed it. He had been waiting for this moment for years, the moment Karen finally faced real consequences. And this was only the beginning. Because Karen, she wasn't getting off that easy. Karen stood frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down on her like a vice. Her usual tricks weren't working. She had tried yelling, she had tried threatening, she had even tried calling the HOA for backup. But none of it mattered now. Her car, her pristine, overpriced status symbol, was locked inside someone else's garage, and she had no control over the situation. And Karen needed control. For years, she had dictated the rules of this neighborhood. She had made people afraid of her. She had been the one knocking on doors, pointing out violations, smugly watching as people scrambled to appease her. But now she was the one stuck outside, pleading for someone else's mercy. And the worst part? The entire neighborhood was watching. Mark had no intention of making this easy for her. He could see it in her eyes, the growing desperation, the bubbling rage she was barely managing to contain. She wanted to scream at him, to demand he open that garage right now. But she knew that if she caused a scene, things would only get worse for her. Because Mark wasn't just standing there enjoying her downfall. No, Mark was making sure that every second of this was a slow, painful humiliation, and he wasn't done yet. Karen's phone buzzed in her hand, and for a split second she clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, someone from the HOA was calling her back with a solution. She fumbled to answer, her voice straining to sound composed. "Yes?" she said, breathless, her eyes darting to Mark as if she was about to reclaim her power. But whatever she heard on the other end made her entire expression shift. Her lips parted slightly, her shoulders tensed. She blinked rapidly as if she was trying to process something she didn't want to believe. Mark smirked. "Let me guess," he said, casually leaning against the doorframe. "They're not backing you up, are they?" Karen didn't answer, because the truth was finally setting in. The HOA, the very organization she had spent years hiding behind, wasn't going to save her. Not this time. They weren't going to twist the rules in her favor. They weren't going to sweep this under the rug. Why? Because Karen wasn't the HOA. Sure, she had acted like she ran the place, but in reality, she was just a loud, annoying presence who had taken it upon herself to enforce rules that no one had ever actually given her the power to enforce. And now, when she needed them most, they weren't answering her calls for help. She had built her kingdom on fear and intimidation, but fear only worked if people believed you had power. And the second they realized you didn't, it was over. Mark took a slow step forward, his expression calm but unmistakably smug. "You know, Karen," he mused, "I was thinking, maybe I should just leave the garage closed for a while, let you cool off a bit." Karen's head snapped up. "You wouldn't." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Wouldn't I?" The panic in her eyes was real now. Mark could leave her car locked inside indefinitely. He was under no obligation to open that garage. There was no rule saying he had to let her in, and technically, she was the one who had broken the rules. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. If Mark wanted to, he could leave her stranded. No car, no way to leave, no way to pretend this never happened. And what was she going to do about it? Call the police? The second she made that call, she would have to explain herself. She would have to admit that she had parked inside someone else's garage without permission. And the moment those words left her mouth, she was the one facing trespassing charges. Mark saw the exact moment she figured it out. The way her posture shifted, her fingers twitching against her phone as if she was resisting the urge to throw it. She was trapped, and she knew it. Karen let out a slow, shaky breath and took a step closer. "Look," she said, her voice softer now. "Let's be reasonable about this." Mark just stared at her, waiting. Karen forced a smile. It didn't reach her eyes. I overstepped. I see that now. Maybe I got a little too comfortable with—" She hesitated, as if the next words physically pained her. "The way I do things. But we're neighbors, Mark. I don't want bad blood between us." Mark crossed his arms. "Oh, I don't have bad blood, Karen." She blinked, thrown off. You don't? No, he said, smiling. I'm having a great time, actually. Karen's left eye twitched. Mark, she said, her voice straining with frustration. Please, I just need my car back. Mark exhaled as if he were considering it. He mused. See, I'd love to help, but I have a problem. Karen stiffened. What problem? Well, Mark continued, drawing out the moment, it's just that you don't seem very sorry. Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. Because she wasn't sorry. She was just sorry she got caught. At this point, the crowd of onlookers had doubled. People were whispering, watching, waiting. And then someone spoke. Hey, Karen, a voice called out. How does it feel? Karen whipped around to see who had dared speak to her like that. It was Jim, her longtime nemesis, the guy she had fined for everything under the sun. His grass was too long, his fence was too bright, his trash cans were a community eyesore. And now he was standing there, smirking at her in front of everyone. Karen's fingers curled into fists. Stay out of this, Jim. But Jim wasn't the only one. A few other neighbors started muttering. A chuckle rippled through the crowd. Someone else called out, Hey, Mark, maybe you should charge her a storage fee. Karen whirled back to Mark, her composure cracking. This isn't funny, she hissed. Mark just shrugged. It kind of is. More laughter. Karen's face turned scarlet. She had spent years treating this neighborhood like her personal kingdom. And now, the entire kingdom was laughing at her. Karen had one last card to play. The one thing she had never done before. Something that would hurt her more than anything else. She took a slow, shaky breath, then lowered her head. And then, in a voice so small that it was barely audible, she muttered the unthinkable, I'm sorry. The crowd went silent. Mark's eyebrows shot up. Come again? Karen's hands clenched at her sides. She lifted her head, hating every second of this. I said, she repeated, her voice tight, I'm sorry. The moment was delicious. For the first time in forever, Karen had no choice but to humble herself. And the best part? Mark wasn't sure if he was ready to let her off the hook just yet, because Karen still had a lot more to learn. The words left Karen's mouth like poison. I'm sorry. She had spent years walking around this neighborhood like a queen, barking orders, punishing people for minor infractions, and twisting HOA rules to suit her whims. But now she was standing outside someone else's garage, powerless, stripped of her authority and forced to apologize. And worse, people were watching. Mark, standing with his arms crossed, didn't react immediately. He let the moment stretch, let Karen feel every agonizing second of her forced humility. The weight of it pressed down on her, her body stiff with humiliation. The neighbors were silent, waiting. Some had their phones out. A few exchanged amused glances. No one was rushing to help her. For once, Karen was alone. Mark studied her for a moment, then tilted his head. That didn't sound very sincere. Karen's jaw clenched. I said it, didn't I? Mark shrugged. Yeah, but I've heard richer apologies from toddlers caught with their hands in the cookie jar. A snicker rippled through the crowd. Karen's face turned red, but this wasn't the usual Karen anger. No, this was frustration mixed with panic, because this was so much worse than she had anticipated. This wasn't just about getting her car back anymore. This was about her reputation. Karen had spent years carefully curating her image. To the HOA board, she was the model of responsibility, a neighborhood enforcer who kept property values high. To the new homeowners, she was a looming presence, making sure they understood who really ran things around here. And to herself, she was untouchable. But that illusion had just shattered, because in the span of an hour, everything had flipped. Instead of being feared, she was now the subject of public humiliation. Instead of people scrambling to appease her, they were laughing at her expense. And worst of all, it was spreading. The neighbors wouldn't let this go. They would tell their friends. Stories would spread. And soon, the entire HOA would know that Karen, the enforcer, the queen of citations, the iron fist of the neighborhood, had been caught trespassing and had to beg for her car back. She felt sick. But what could she do? She had nothing left. Her threats had failed. The HOA wasn't backing her up. And Mark, he had her right where he wanted her. Karen forced her voice to remain steady. "What do you want, Mark?" Mark grinned. "Oh, I'm glad you asked." He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and took his sweet time scrolling. Karen's eyes narrowed. "What are you doing?" Mark held up the screen. "Just checking the HOA guidelines. You know, the real ones, not the ones you make up as you go." More laughter. Karen gritted her teeth. "Get to the point." Mark lowered the phone and smiled. "Here's the deal. You want your car back? Fine. But first, you're going to sign a written statement admitting you parked in my garage without permission." Karen's entire body went rigid. "What?" Mark pulled a folded sheet of paper from his back pocket and held it up. "I had some time while you were making your little phone call," he said casually. "Figured I'd draft something up. Just a quick little confession. You know, for official purposes." Karen didn't move, because she knew exactly what this meant. If she signed that, Mark would have written proof that she had trespassed, and if this ever escalated, if she ever tried to retaliate, he could use that statement against her. It was a trap she had no way out of. Karen swallowed. "No." Mark shrugged. "All right." And then, without hesitation, he turned and walked back into his house. Karen blinked. "Wait, where are you going?" Mark didn't even look back. "Mark!" she called, a little louder now. Still nothing. She turned toward the neighbors, looking for support, for someone, anyone, to tell her she didn't have to do this. But they were just watching, enjoying this. Some were smiling, others whispering. No one was helping. Karen's chest tightened. Mark was really going to leave her out here. She turned back to his door, hesitated, then took a slow, shaky step forward. Her pride was screaming at her, telling her to turn around, to fight back, to refuse to play into his game. But she had no choice, not anymore. Karen raised a fist and knocked. The door opened almost immediately. Mark stood there, arms crossed. "Something you need?" Karen exhaled sharply. "Give me the paper." He smiled. "Good choice." Mark handed her the document. Karen's eyes scanned the page quickly, her stomach twisting with every line. It was straightforward but damning. "I, Karen's full name, acknowledge that I entered the private garage of Mark's full name without permission and parked my vehicle there without his consent. I understand that this action was inappropriate and a violation of personal property rights." Below that, a line for her signature. Karen hesitated, her hands trembling. Once she signed this, she could never take it back. Mark, sensing her hesitation, leaned against the doorframe. "Take your time," he said smoothly. "I've got all day." Karen did not. Her humiliation was growing by the second. The neighbors were still watching. Some had phones out. Her reputation was shrinking by the minute. She had no other way out. With gritted teeth, she grabbed the pen, and then she signed it. The moment the ink dried, Mark plucked the paper from her hands and grinned. "Well," he said, folding it neatly, "now that that's settled, let's get your car out, shall we?" Mark pressed the garage door button. The door rumbled open. Karen stood there, feeling like she had just made a deal with the devil. The second the garage was fully open, she rushed forward like a drowning woman gasping for air. She threw the driver's side door open, slid in, and started the engine in one swift motion. She just needed to get out of here. But just as she shifted into reverse, Mark leaned against the garage doorframe. One more thing. Karen's grip on the steering wheel tightened. What now? Mark tapped the folded paper. "Try pulling any of your usual stunts, Karen. Try filing a bogus HOA complaint against me. This goes public." Karen's jaw clenched. Mark grinned. Have a great day. And with that, Karen backed out and sped away. The neighbors cheered. Karen's reign was over, and she knew it. The moment Karen sped away from Mark's driveway, her tires screeching slightly against the pavement, she realized something chilling. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Sure, she had escaped the immediate humiliation, but what had just happened wasn't something that would disappear overnight. In fact, as she raced home, her mind spiraled through the consequences, each one more horrifying than the last. This was going to spread. The neighbors had seen everything. Some had recorded it. Mark now had written proof of her trespassing, a confession that was legally irrefutable. And worst of all, her reputation, the power she had used to control this neighborhood for years, was crumbling. Karen barely made it inside her house before her phone rang again. She didn't even need to look at the caller ID. It was the HOA board. This time they weren't ignoring her. They weren't brushing her aside like they had earlier when she had called them in a panic. Now, they wanted to talk. But Karen had a sinking feeling this conversation wasn't going to be the lifeline she needed. She hesitated before answering, inhaling deeply to steady herself. Then, pressing the phone to her ear, she forced out the most neutral tone she could manage. Hello? Karen. The voice on the other end was clipped, professional but unmistakably icy. It was the HOA president. We need to discuss what happened today, he continued, wasting no time on pleasantries. We've been getting reports. Karen's stomach twisted. Reports? There was a slight pause. Then, yes. Multiple neighbors have informed us of an incident involving trespassing, and we need to be clear, this is a serious matter. Karen swallowed hard. Trespassing. That wasn't just a slap on the wrist. That wasn't something she could smooth over with an apology letter or a small fine. That was something that could get her removed. She forced herself to stay calm. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Another pause. Then came the words that confirmed her worst fear. No, Karen, there hasn't. Karen gripped the phone tighter. She had been in this position before. Someone challenging her authority, calling her out, trying to hold her accountable. But she had always found a way out. Not this time. This time she had no defense. The HOA board wasn't coming to her rescue. They weren't siding with her. Because deep down, they had been waiting for something like this. For years, Karen had pushed boundaries. She had inserted herself into HOA matters she wasn't supposed to be a part of. She had written citations that weren't official. She had issued fines that weren't technically enforceable. And every time someone complained, she found some way to weasel out of it. But now there was evidence. Now there were witnesses. Now she wasn't just a difficult HOA member. She was a liability. Karen barely had time to process the HOA's cold dismissal before she heard it. The sound of footsteps outside. Curious, she crossed the room and peeked through her window. And then her stomach dropped. Neighbors were gathering. Some stood on sidewalks, whispering in hushed tones. Others were directly across the street, looking at her house, shaking their heads. And then she saw Jim. Jim, the same neighbor she had terrorized for years over the improper height of his grass. The same neighbor she had fined for having his trash bins out 30 minutes too early. He was holding something in his hands, a clipboard. Karen's breath hitched, because she knew what that meant. Jim turned, catching her eyes through the window. And then he smirked. He held up the clipboard just enough for her to see. And in bold letters across the top of the page, her worst nightmare was written out in ink. Petition to remove Karen from all HOA committee involvement. Karen stumbled back from the window. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't real. The neighborhood had never stood up to her before. They had always grumbled quietly, rolled their eyes behind her back, but at the end of the day, they had complied. But now? Now they weren't just talking, they were acting. Her hands trembled as she grabbed her phone again. She needed leverage. She needed to remind people who she was. She scrolled through her HOA contacts looking for anyone who could help her. Maybe the HOA board wasn't entirely against her. Maybe she could spin this, but then she saw the group chat, a neighborhood-wide chat that she had always controlled. And now it was flooded with messages. So glad someone finally put Karen in her place. She's been a menace for years. Mark deserves a medal for what he did. I just signed the petition. Hope she gets kicked out of the HOA completely. Karen's vision blurred. Everything she had built, every ounce of control she had maintained over this community, was slipping away. She had one last move: damage control. She clicked the chat, her fingers flying across the screen. Karen. Everyone needs to calm down. There are rules that need to be followed. This was a simple misunderstanding. She hit send, and then someone replied instantly. Mark. Oh, you mean like the rules about not trespassing on private property? Because I have that in writing now. Karen's breath caught. Then another message appeared. Jim. LOL. Just sign the petition, everyone. Let's make sure she's done for good. Karen could only stare. The chat was exploding. Everyone was against her now. And the worst part? There was nothing she could do to stop it. Every notification was a fresh humiliation. Can't believe we let her push us around for so long. What's she gonna do now? Fine herself? Mark, you deserve free drinks for a year. Petition to make Mark the new HOA president. Who's in? Karen's throat tightened. They weren't just celebrating her downfall, they were actively erasing her from the power she had spent years building. She had spent so much time crafting her role as the ultimate enforcer, the neighborhood watchdog, the final say on what was allowed and what wasn't. And now? Now she wasn't just powerless, she was a joke. For years, Karen had ruled through intimidation. She had made people hesitate before speaking back to her, made them fear the consequences of disobedience. A garbage bin left out 5 minutes too long? She was there with a citation, a car parked slightly over the line in a driveway. She took photos and sent warnings, a holiday decoration that wasn't on the approved list. Fined. She had thrived off the control, off the way people avoided her gaze, the way they scrambled to fix violations before she could report them. But now nobody cared what she thought. She had no authority, no influence, not even a voice. And what was worse, people were happy about it. Karen's entire routine had been built around enforcement. Her mornings started with walking the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, taking notes on anything that violated HOA standards. Afternoons were spent filing complaints, detailing infractions with precise documentation, sending them off to the board, waiting for the inevitable letters to arrive at her neighbors' doors. Evenings, that was her time to monitor, to patrol, to remind people that she was watching. But now there was nothing to enforce. The clipboard sat untouched on her kitchen counter, covered in dust. The emails she sent to the HOA board went unanswered. And worst of all, no more notices were being sent out. The new HOA board had implemented a system where only legitimate violations, ones that were actually on the official HOA bylaws, would be addressed, which meant that almost all of Karen's complaints were tossed out immediately. And the neighborhood, they were finally free. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat, so she did what she always did. She tried to fight back. First, she attempted to rally the few people who had supported her in the past, the ones who had whispered to her about their grievances, the ones who had enjoyed seeing their neighbors get fined because they thought it kept the neighborhood orderly. But when she reached out, silence. The people who had once nodded along to her rules now didn't want to be associated with her. She was toxic, a symbol of everything people had hated about the HOA. Then she tried filing complaints directly with the city. If the HOA wouldn't enforce her standards, maybe the local government would. She filed reports about unkept lawns, reports about fences being too high, reports about driveways needing repaving. But the city? They had actual priorities. And Karen? She wasn't one of them. Every complaint she filed was dismissed. Karen was desperate to reclaim some kind of control. She had spent years enforcing standards, and now she was watching the neighborhood relax in a way that made her skin crawl. And then, the letter arrived. A crisp, official-looking envelope. Karen's heart leapt. For a moment, she thought maybe, just maybe, the HOA was finally coming to its senses. Maybe they were going to reinstate her power. Maybe this was her chance to come back. But when she tore open the envelope, her stomach dropped. Because this wasn't a letter giving her authority back. It was a violation notice, addressed to her. Dear Ms. Gray, Karen's last name, it has come to our attention that your property is currently in violation of HOA regulations regarding the following: improperly stored trash bins, overgrown front yard foliage, unauthorized modification of home exterior, shutters painted unapproved color. Please address these violations within 30 days or risk further action. Karen's hands shook. She reread the letter, her eyes darting over the words, looking for some kind of mistake. But there wasn't one. It was official. She, the person who had handed out more fines than anyone else in the neighborhood, was now being fined herself. And the worst part? The violations were all things she had ignored on her own property while she was too busy policing everyone else's. Her own yard hadn't been maintained properly. Her own shutters had been painted a shade that wasn't on the approved color list. Her own trash bins had been left visible. She had been so obsessed with controlling everyone else that she had completely failed to follow her own rules. That violation notice was the final straw. The neighbors laughed about it. People took pictures of the letter on her door. Some even joked about starting a fundraiser to help Karen pay her fine. And Karen? She disappeared. No more patrols, no more HOA meetings, no more Karen. Her empire was gone, her power erased, and the neighborhood. They thrived without her. No one lived in fear of surprise violations anymore. No one worried about whether their lawn decorations would be reported. People were free to enjoy their homes without the shadow of Karen looming over them. And Mark, he became a legend, the man who took down the HOA tyrant, who gave the neighborhood its freedom. And Karen? She became a cautionary tale, the woman who tried to control everything and lost it all. And nobody, not a single soul in that neighborhood, missed her. The end of Karen, the beginning of a neighborhood finally at peace.